Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the St. Jean Paul II National Shrine by the media, and we are very happy to welcome you for this new episode of Memory and Identity Conversation series, named after Pope John Paul's book, Memory and Identity, Conversation at the Dawn of the New Millennium. This last published book, in which he shared historical, philosophical, and religious insight of the events of the 20th century. In a similar conversational tone, this series explores Pope John Paul II's legacy and the Church's response to pivotal questions to our time. We are very happy to welcome here today His Excellency Archbishop Christophe Pierre, Apostolic Nuncio to the United States, Dr. Margaret Melady, and by phone, Reverend Drew Christiansen. And our moderator today is Gloria Purvis. Gloria Purvis is a host of EWTN's Morning Glory radio show. Gloria graduated from Cornell University with a Bachelor's of Science in Human Development and Family Studies. A profound experience in the real presence of Jesus in the Eucharist led her to the Catholic faith when she was 12 years old in Charleston, South Carolina. As adult woman, while professing the creed during Mass here in Washington, and our faith in the giver of life, she fully dedicated herself to proclaim the gospel of life with her husband. Gloria served on the Archdiocesan Pastoral Council for the Archdiocese of Washington. She's a board member of the Northwest Pregnancy Center and Maternity Home in Washington, D.C., and an advisory board member of the Maryland Catholic Conference Respect for Life Department. She serves on the National Black Catholic Congress Leadership Commission on Social Justice. She is the chairperson for Black Catholics United for Life, which seeks to increase the size and strength of active Black Catholics participating in the pro-life movement. Thank you for being with us today. Gloria, it's your turn.
Thank you so much. I would like to share a little bit about each of our distinguished panelists. First, His Excellency Archbishop Christophe Pierre. Goodness, I read your biography and I was so impressed. You did military service. You studied not only in France, but also in Madagascar and Morocco. You also have a master in sacred theology, a doctorate in canon law. You then served, it seems like, all over the world. You were in New Zealand, you were in Mozambique, Zimbabwe, Cuba, Brazil, and in Geneva, Switzerland, and also spent time in Uganda and Mexico. And then on April 12th, 2016, His Holiness Pope Francis appointed you to be Apostolic Nuncio to the United States. And you also speak multiple languages: French, Italian, English, Spanish, and Portuguese. But most importantly, you speak the language of the gospel, which unites all of us. We also have on the panel with us Dr. Margaret Melady. She currently serves as chair of the nominating committee of the Federal Association of the Order of Malta, where she served as president from 2014 through 2018. She has published books on social and political issues, international culture, and communications, and is the author of Pope John Paul II, The Pastoral Visit as a New Vocabulary of the Sacred. It was published in 1999. Her late husband, Thomas P. Melady, was a U.S. ambassador to the Vatican from 1989 to 1993. And joining us virtually is Father Drew Christiansen. He's a Jesuit priest, and he is the Distinguished Professor of Ethics and Global Human Development at Georgetown University, and he is also a Senior Fellow at the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs. Pope John Paul II named Father Christiansen an expert for the Synod for America. He met with the late Pope as an academic advisor for the Santissimus Annus Foundation. As director of the Office of International Justice and Peace, he raised funds for the Pope's pilgrimage to the Holy Land during the Great Jubilee in the year 2000. And he also led a delegation of U.S. bishops to participate in the celebration of that journey. Father Christiansen continues to serve as an advisor on nuclear disarmament and other matters to the Holy See. Thank you all so much for joining us. And you know, what I find remarkable is that you all can bear witness to having met the Holy Father, Pope John Paul II. And I'm looking forward to all that you're willing to share with us regarding the Holy Father that will also help us in understanding our current Holy Father. So with that, I will not talk right now. I will let you begin to share your wisdom, and then I will ask each of you some questions and try to facilitate the conversation. And to those of us who are joining virtually, please do feel free to send in your questions via Facebook and YouTube, and we will try to get to those questions before the end of the program. Thank you, Your Excellency.
Thank you, Gloria. I think I need to take a mic. I don't like that. I like to be free to speak without a mic. But anyway, so you asked us to give a kind of witness about Pope John Paul II. Yes. Indeed, I've known him. I have worked for him for many years. May I say it, Pope, like all the popes I have served, by the way, he has been part of my life. So I am so grateful for the opportunity to reflect on the pontificate of Saint John Paul II. A good part of my priestly life was spent in service of Peter's successors, a total of 47 years from Pope Paul VI in 1973. That's when I arrived in Rome in order to study for a few years, to Pope Francis today. There is a continuity. I think it's so important not to forget that. There is no different, the church is going on, and we are so happy to live in the church, because the church is really the sacrament of God's presence in our human reality. So we are supposed to be there. We are not living in the church of the past. We are projected towards the future, but we have to live today. So nowadays, I have come upon a multitude of interviews in which so many people are saying wonderful things about John Paul II, sharing their anecdotal stories or personal memories of their encounters with the late pontiff. What stays with me is this reflection. In this reflection is a method of great continuity throughout John Paul II pontificate and his teaching. Beyond the particularity of temperament and personality, it is impressive to observe how each pope was able to enter into a providential plan and become an instrument of the Lord of history. That's our belief, isn't it? There is a phrase, in my modest opinion, that can help us understand the full dynamics of John Paul II pontificate. And this phrase is found in the teaching of his successor, Pope Benedict XVI encyclical Deus Caritas Est. You know, this encyclical was published on the 25th of December 2005. This is the sentence. We have come to believe in God's love. In these words, the Christian can express the fundamental decision of his life. Being Christian is not the result of an ethical choice or a lofty idea, but the encounter with an event, a person, which gives life a new horizon and a decisive direction. This is a sentence which I like. And I can tell you, Pope Francis likes it also because he has quoted it many times. So please, keep that 10 cents in your mind. You should memorize it. Maybe if you like me to repeat it, I can do it, but it's not the moment. It is no coincidence that this very phrase was quoted in Evangelii Gaudium, the document that proposes the programmatic encounter of Pope Francis. This phrase is what the entire pontificate of Francis is all about. But it is taken from Benedict, interesting, who only brought to a conclusion the entire work of more than 25 years, prepared mainly by John Paul II himself after the council and as a fruit of the council. I still remember with my amazement when reading John Paul II's first encyclical in 1979. The Redeemer of man, Jesus Christ, is the center of the cosmos and history. That was a quotation of this encyclical. It was a prophecy of faith of the late Pope himself. He was totally focused on Vatican II, which had been at the center of my own seminary training. You know, I entered into the major seminary in '63 during the council. The Pontiff took up the same theme in Gaudium et Spes when he said, the Church, I quote, the Church holds that in her most benign Lord and Master can be found the key, the focal point, and the goal of man as well as of all human history. Of quote. That was the number 10 of Gaudium et Spes. Gaudium et Spes was one of the main documents of Vatican II. John Paul II spoke of a solemn hour that the Church and the entire contemporary human family are living. And with an important mention, this time is already very close to the year 2000. At that time, you know, it was about 20 years before, the great Jubilee year. So, as early as 1979, it could be understood that the 59-year-old Pope, a young man, isn't it, already had a vision for the Jubilee celebration of the event of God's incarnation in history. The word event is a very important one. You know, the incarnation of God is not an idea. It's not a philosophy. It's not a set of principles of morals. It's an event, something which happened in history. What followed was an extraordinarily fruitful 20 years of preparation throughout the Church. We have discovered this preparation and accompanied it. You know, I've lived in the Nunciators for these 20 years. I remember my enthusiasm for that. Personally, I've lived it with great joy and great expectation. What's also remarkable was a succession of important documents that has guided us with extraordinary coherence and admirable pedagogy. You know, the Church has a pedagogy. The Church is supposed to help people to understand the mystery of God's presence in our humanity. The first of John Paul II, 3 encyclicals on the three persons of the Trinity is, and we have already spoken about it, Redemptor Hominis, the Redemptor of man, on Jesus Christ, 1979. The second is Dives in Misericordia, deep in mercy, on God the Father, 1980, 1 year later. It's interesting, isn't it? The third is Dominum et Vivificantem, on the Holy Spirit. It was supposed to be published 1 year later, but it was published a bit later in 1986 due to the attack on the Pope in 1981. You remember, you know, on St. Peter's Square. And the interesting aspect of this third document on the Holy Spirit, on the second one, sorry, on Dives in Misericordia, is the experience of Saint Faustina Kowalska, precisely on the mystery of God's mercy. And Faustina Kowalska was not yet known at that time, but she was coming from Poland. And Pope John Paul II was a devoted of her, and she became known all over the place. And you know the importance of her spirituality in the life of the church today. And it's also important to remember that one of the first year of the pontificate of Pope Francis was about mercy. So, there is such a connection, isn't it? In 1987, the encyclical Redemptoris Mater on Mary, Redemptoris Mater, the mother of the Redemptor, you remember the first one, Redemptor hominis, everything is very well connected. So this encyclical was also published, 87, so 81, 82, 86, 87. Carry on, huh? So the encyclical was closely linked to the first one on Christ, her Son. It was not immediately known that John Paul II had in this way laid the foundations that would be picked up again in 1996 by his apostolic letter Tertio Millennio Adveniente, in which the pontiff invited the whole church to prepare for the Jubilee. It would be a whole year of retreat, reflection, and catechesis on each person of the Trinity, with a strong emphasis on recapturing the three corresponding encyclicals. Imagine. The Jubilee celebration was quite fruitful and beautiful. I remember it, What impressed me most, however, was the apostolic letter Novo Millennio Ineunte. There was Novo Millennio Adveniente before. Now, after the Jubilee, Novo Millennio Ineunte, entering into the new millennium, that came out in the year 2000. At the beginning of the new millennium, the document was totally focused, again, on the person of Christ. Everything starts from Christ. It does not start from ourselves. Maybe for the moment, at times, even in this country, I'm sorry to say that, we are a bit confused. We think that the church depends on our own efforts. We think that the church depends from our own ideas. We have become the masters of the orthodoxy of the church. And we forget about the Pope. And we criticize the Pope so easily. A bit of patience, a bit of humility would be good, isn't it? Beyond the simple enumeration of documents expressing a well-articulated program, it is worth highlighting the method of John Paul II. And I would like to insist upon that. Providence. Providence is the motto of the church, isn't it? The providence of God. Providence has had intellectually, spiritually, and pastorally prepared a person with a Thomistic formation, a strong one, who could meet the challenges of phenomenology and existentialism. In his works, and person, and act, and so forth, all the famous works, because, he was quite a writer, a philosopher, principally. John Paul II developed a method that allowed for the identification of the person as primary. The person is primary, opening up a path to that which is irreducible a man through his actions. Irreducible. There we find Benedict's phrase, again, being Christians is the encounter with an event, a person, an encounter. In the meantime, I am asking myself, would not this be the source of Francis' vision? Good question, isn't it? We have to answer to that. Like all the great philosophers and theologians of the 20th century, and I think about Urs von Balthasar, Romano Guardini, Monsignor Giussani, and they were all Francis's teachers. John Paul II thought an answer to the great challenge of modernity. You know, today, our church is confronted with the challenges of modernity. Like Francis and Benedict, John Paul also recognized with contemporary sensibility. I think this is so important. We live in today's world. We have to be confronted with the challenges of today. We cannot just repeat what happens in the past. The problematic of the past is not the problematic of today. How the question of the relationship between truth and freedom must always be taken into consideration in realizing an authentic evangelization. What we have to do is to evangelize the people of today, the young people of today, with their mentality. This is what Pope Francis is trying to do. It's a hard job, but it's a job of the church. This search for a proper anthropology that could adequately articulate truth and freedom is found. And that's wonderful. In Redemptor Hominis, the first encyclical of Pope John Paul II, and was later deepened in another document so important, Fides et Ratio. Fides et Ratio, 1998, just a couple of years before the celebration of the Jubilee. The whole magnificent program to prepare for the Jubilee year 2000 was built upon a reflection which, permit me to quote them, if you will, some friends of mine, Guerra, Buttiglione, have called a return to the person. Another person who is called Angelo Scola, in a book called The Elementary Experience, teaches us that the anthropology proposed by John Paul II is an integral personalism. Integral. It's important. Always open toward transcendence. We cannot remain enclosed on ourselves. In the end, it is a question of offering us, the persons who are always historically situated, the possibility of living an encounter with the person of Christ without giving up our own freedom. It's quite complicated, isn't it? But this is the beauty of the incarnation of God. The church has a mission to make us know and follow, as disciples, the same Christ who leads us to his and our Father in the Spirit. It seems to me that the source of John Paul II's extraordinary pastoral dynamism, to which millions of people have responded, was precisely this: to know how to direct all the energies of the church towards the very concrete proposal of an encounter with Christ in the fullness of his Trinitarian mystery, manifested through a truly missionary church.
Thank you so much. We will delve more into your comments once we get all of the panelists to share some of their recollections and memories and thoughts about the Holy Father. So Dr. Melady, I'm turning to you. You lived in Rome. You also had the privilege of meeting and knowing the Holy Father. And I'm wondering, especially when you talked about his travels as a new vocabulary of the sacred, what wisdom you would share with us today regarding the Holy Father that you think is important at this time for us in the United States to recall and to think about?
Well, I've been thinking here, saying, what was my first, encounter with the Holy Father? And actually, it kind of goes back a little ways. So if you put it in context, it was my husband and I were living in Connecticut. He was president of Sacred Heart University, and the community in that area, in Fairfield and Bridgeport, which was very close to us, was very much an immigrant population. And so you had all sorts of ethnic Catholics. You had Romanian Catholics, you had Irish Catholics, you had all sorts of different ethnic groups, and a very large Polish community. So that Polish community was very much involved with the university that we were at, and so my husband, was fascinated with Cardinal Wojtyła, and he was coming to the United States. So he asked the board of directors if he could give an honorary degree to Cardinal Wojtyła. So Cardinal Wojtyła answered yes, he'd love to do that, and he would arrange to do that on his next trip. And his next trip was mainly in Boston and the Massachusetts area. So that was all set. We had the date all confirmed. But at the last minute, the cardinal decided he had to change his plans, and so therefore he couldn't come down to accept come from Massachusetts down to Connecticut to accept it. So he phoned Tom, and he said, well, could you come up to Massachusetts to give this to me? And Tom said, I'm sorry, Cardinal, Your Excellency, Your Eminence, I'm so sorry that I can't do this, because the board and our bylaws absolutely say I can only give that honorary degree on the site of the university. So Cardinal Wojtyła said, that's okay, I'll come the next time I come to the States. Well, a little bit further in our year, a couple of years later, Cardinal Wojtyła becomes the Pope. So, okay, he's not coming to accept an honorary degree anymore. But at any rate, the Polish community, of course, was so excited. I mean, and you can understand that. And, to have, of course, a first non-Italian Pope in quite a few years, centuries, I guess, and that, and having it come from Poland, which was still under communist control, but having a person that they just felt so close to. And it was wonderful how, we kind of melded into this community and understood that here was a person who came from a background where his religion, our Catholic religion in Poland was being attacked, and you were unable to do many of the things that we could do in the United States. And he coped with that, and he thought creatively about it, and how he could, help his people enjoy the wonderful fruits and of their faith. So, fast forward. My husband is named ambassador to the Vatican, and we go off to Rome, and we do our formal presentation to the Holy Father, and he goes in and talks with the Holy Father, and it's a very formal greeting. And then the Pope says, oh, by the way, how about that honorary degree? And I think that was, the indication. Here you have a person who is head of the church, the Pope, someone who, just naturally you're going to have this tremendous respect for the person. But he's so human. He's just so human. And that's, of course, his philosophy. How you can, how we are all part of this human race, and how Jesus Christ became human for us, and how we can explore all of those fruits of being human, and yet also be very close to our God and Maker. So.
Well, thank you for sharing that. It reminds us that the Holy Father was a man of his word. He's like, when I come back, and he inquired about it. I love that. Yes.
May I just ask something?
Sure.
3 years ago, I received an honorary degree from the same university.
Wonderful. So you had the same honorary degree. That's wonderful. And now Father Drew Christiansen is on the line. And Father Drew, you were able to be an expert in the Synod for America and also an advisor to Centesimus Annus Foundation. In light of what we've heard so far, we would love for you to share your reflections on the Holy Father, John Paul II.
Well, thank you, Gloria, and greetings to my fellow panelists. Yeah, I understand that félicitations are in order because this is the anniversary of his ordination to the episcopate today, so I wanted to congratulate him. And Dr. Melady, good to talk to you again. It's been a long time since we've seen one another. I'd say, one of the things that impressed me of John Paul was his strength of mind, and you pick up little things, but they really strike you because they're privileged moments when you meet the Holy Father. In America,
Father, it looks like we're quite lost your connection. Please join us again when you can. Just start talking. But if I may, I'm going to ask some questions of Dr. Melady and Archbishop Christophe. So one of the things that
okay, I'll call again.
Oh, are you back with us? Let's see. Can you try speaking? Yes, we can hear you now, Father Drew.
Okay. I was saying that the Holy Father had a great strength of mind and foresight, and I think calling the Synod for America was one of those. It was the Synod for America, and it was a call for us in the North and those in the South to consider ourselves one in the Church of Christ. And that was very hard because in English, we make the distinction between North and South America. We don't talk about one continent, but two, but the Spanish language only has one language, El Continente. It's one continent, the Americas. And it was very hard for us when we were drafting documents to try to accommodate that insight. But he very much wanted to see the people of the North and the people of the South come together. And the function of the Synod was partially to get the bishops to meld together and to act together. And I think that was a very important development. In that context, excuse me, Venite called for debt relief, and that was one of the big issues to be
Father Drew, can you repeat that again? We had you cut out just a little bit. Could you repeat that again right before you were speaking about debt?
Yeah, he in Tertio Millennio, he had urged debt relief as part of the Jubilee, building on the biblical foundation of the Great Jubilees every 7 or 49 years. Excuse me, and set things in motion to bring that about. And I was privileged to work on his behalf with the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund and the U.S. Treasury in trying to realize that and encourage U.S. participation in that movement. Excuse me. Speaking of a strength of mind, I met him on the second night of the Synod at dinner, and I was introduced to him after night visit in this chapel. I didn't see him again until 3 weeks later, well, in person, face to face, but 3 weeks later. And then he said to me, "Oh, you're the Jesuit from New York." I just was astounded with all the people he was meeting. He could remember that I was from New York. And the night visit was a clear indication of a man of prayer. I mean, you could see the intensity of his prayer when we were with him. And the same thing was true in the Jubilee year in Jerusalem. At the end of the visit, there was a celebratory banquet at the Latin Patriarchate. And the Holy Father indicated during dinner that he wanted to go again back to the Holy Sepulchre to pray. Well, the city had been opened up from the time he'd been there in the morning. And the Israelis had to lock it down. They had to activate the special machine they had for taking him down the stairs of the old city. But what was remarkable was that here he was, leaning on a cane and having difficulty walking. And the steps to the Calvary altar where he was going are very high. I always had trouble, even when my legs were good, getting up there in vestments. And here he was going back and climbing those stairs again and remaining another 45 minutes in prayer. It was really, really quite remarkable. The other thing I think that I just want to note is the force of his personality having effect on great people. I talked about the debt relief. Jim Mobilson, the head of the World Bank, and Michel Camdessou of the International Monetary Fund really engaged in that Jubilee debt relief and increased it over the next several years because of their association with the Holy Father. In Poland, and many people don't know this, but in Poland he had twice intervened with Russian presidents to prevent Russian invasion, to put down strikes and revolutionary activity in Poland. Once with Brezhnev, and then another time with Gorbachev. And with Gorbachev and General Zalesky, he had arranged for an election in 1989, which Solidarity could, the labor union could run as a political party. And instead, of course, the Iron Curtain fell, and the limitations that had been set upon the original possibilities of Solidarity were lifted, and Solidarity came into the full control of the government. But what was important there was he was able to influence the great men of his period. And finally, one of my staffers at the Bishops' Conference, Tom Quigley, who's covered Latin America for many years, once remarked that wherever he went, whether it was a repressive regime, whether it was human rights problems, John Paul left a legacy so that within 2 years, the conditions would change and governments would fall. He had tremendous kind of personal power. That's where I'm right now. Hello?
Yes, we're here. We're listening.
Okay. That's where I'll end my reflections right there.
Oh, good. Well, I'm going to turn and ask some questions, some that I've heard in people reading Fratelli Tutti. And I'm thinking as we talk about the Holy Father, John Paul II, how he traveled the world and took the person of Christ with him and really embraced everyone as a brother and sister in Christ in friendship, united in the gospel. I'm wondering how you could help us understand. Some people are like, what does social friendship mean? Which our Holy Father Francis explicitly mentions in Fratelli Tutti. In light of John Paul II, I mean, in looking at his example of when he traveled the world and how he was just loved by so many and seemed to love everyone else as well, how might we understand social friendship as the Holy Father, Pope Francis, talks about it now in light of John Paul II? I'll ask you first.
Well, I would say social friendship is the gospel. A lot of people have, many people have not yet read the encyclical of Pope Francis, but they always, a lot of people begin to criticize it without reading it. I think it's a bit shameful. But anyway, it's really the friendship with everybody. This is Redemptor Hominis. I think this is the Pope is saying. We have encountered Christ, the Son of God, and this encounter has changed our life. The encounter of Christ has changed my life. I am different with him, and he opens me to the friendship with everybody. It's not a naive kind of attitude. No. We are fully aware of the difficulty of the differences between people. We are very fully aware of the situation of injustice, of abuse of human rights, all the problems. But the method the method in order to resolve the problem is not war, is not hate, is not closing ourselves in a small sect. The Catholic Church is not a sect. The Catholic Church is the community of people who have met Christ and who are open to the whole world in order to change the world, not with their own efforts. Yes, with their own efforts, but animated, inspired by the love that Christ gave us, because he comes himself from the Holy Father. He fills us with his own spirit, and he gives us the power, the capacity to love everybody. If I love my brother who is different from me, I don't lose anything. I think it's so important. And this is what Pope Francis is telling us, he's in encyclical. This is why I think it's correspond, in my opinion. And it corresponds really to the challenge of the time, especially to even the challenge of our society today. When we are confronted with a polarized society as we are today, we need people who, like St. Francis of Assisi, are inspired by this fratelli tutti, all brothers. We are not naive, but we want, to see every man and woman as a brother and a sister.
Dr. Melady, your background in international culture and communications and politics in particular probably could also help us understand, from your perspective, how we should understand social friendship as is mentioned in Fratelli Tutti, and also with your new vocabulary of the sacred. How should we also, in your opinion, what would you add to the conversation about social friendship?
Well, I think that in a sense, if what struck me and why I decided to look into this whole issue of John Paul II's international visits was that he was really concerned about, again, he was concerned about some of the issues of our secular society, this extreme individualism, and he wanted to go out and do some pastoral visits, exactly what he was doing. Now, he wasn't the first pope to do that. Paul VI made a number of visits. But I think that John Paul II really institutionalized the international visits as pastoral visits. And what really struck me was that he, of course, he'd come on a visit and everybody wanted to be there to meet him. It was carrying, coming out of Rome, but bringing the Pope here, or bringing the Pope to Latin America or to Africa. And the way the trips were planned, you always had these very large gatherings. And there was always this sense of everyone coming together as a community, of being together and appreciating each other and loving each other and hugging each other. And of course, the Pope did that, on many of his visits. He would, of course, go through the crowd and greet the crowd and then stop once in a while. I remember that in New York one time, I think, there were people in wheelchairs set up along the road just to greet him as he passed in his motorcade. And he stopped. He stopped and went out and greeted all of the those who were there to greet him. And there were instances like that in many other countries too. I mean, he was in Togo one time, and this is a fun story. One time I talked with I think Monsignor Tucci, who was telling me how when he first went out to plan a trip, he went to Africa and he had it all planned that they were going to stop in this village and the Pope was going to stop in this particular house, little thatched hut. And then when they got there, everything had changed. The village had been spruced up. The house had been, given a new roof or whatever. And so in the future, he said, well, in the future, I was very careful not to tell any of the local authorities where we were going. So then in Togo, that's what happened. They stopped at a village, and he went out and he greeted this woman who was in her very modest hut and hugged her and talked to her. And it was, it was just one of those symbolisms that he was so good at doing. He had been an actor. He knew how to carry this out, to tell us how we can love. That was really what he was doing, how we can be a community together and love each other. So
that reminds me of when our Holy Father, Pope Francis, came to the United States, and when he went to Philadelphia, how he went to a jail. And a friend of mine was actually the chaplain at the jail, and he was telling me inside how the incarcerated were stunned that our Holy Father would come to see them. And that the Muslim prisoners got to work on carving a chair for him, which is in Rome now. And just he said that the way that the people felt like, we are somebody, we are beloved. And so that just makes me think of when you talk about John Paul II stopping off in this little village to see the people, makes me think also of how our Holy Father, Pope Francis, went to a jail when he came here in the United States, and what message that has for us as well. Now, Father Drew, you in working on disarmament, I keep thinking about that, and there's been a lot of conversation recently about Nagasaki and the bombings and things like that. How can we, in light of when our Holy Father's call for social friendship, how does that influence, in your opinion, the calls for disarmament?
Well, I think disarmament has to come as John the 23rd said, and Francis has repeated, that it has to come out of a basic trust and friendship among peoples, and it can't just be the act of diplomats and treaties. You can't disarm if in your soul you haven't changed. And I think that in the relationship of the Japanese people and people in the United States, there's still a reconciliation that needs to come about after. We're still dealing with problems of reconciliation in this country 140 years after the Civil War, or more than 160 years after the Civil War. And it seems to me that we haven't fully dealt with the hurts that are there on the Japanese or on our side because of what they perpetrated in World War II. And so I think reconciliation is essential, and it's in the spirit of friendship that reconciliation needs to happen. Disarmament is difficult, and these days it's more difficult than ever. And so setting a good tone, building up relationships is very important. Our most important partners in the U.S. for disarmament are the Russians, and the communication between the U.S. and the Russia is now very meager. There are 3 flights a day from Washington to Beijing, or there was before the pandemic, but there was only 1 flight a week to Moscow. That gives you a sense of the lack of interchange between the U.S. and the Russians, although, there are places where the Russians are reaching out. And I think we need to build up that relationship. There are all sorts of mechanisms for discussion that were set up between arms controllers, between military people, and civic friendship between civic groups in the period after the end of the Cold War, and with the disarmament that took place in the late 90s and early 2000s. And it seems to me that it's very important to begin to create those conditions. Some are technical, like monitoring and verification, but other just changes of officers and people with policy responsibility to get to know one another and to work more closely with one another. So I think, the spirit of friendship has to be there when there's really genuine negotiation going on, especially if you have to encounter a large human problem like Nuncio disarmament. The spirit of social friendship includes a love of the common good. And in the ancient world and in the medieval world, the notion of social friendship was one in which the friendship of people was one in which they worked together for the common good. And it seems to me that's what has to be done in the field of disarmament, especially in the upcoming Non-Proliferation Treaty review in January in New York.
Thank you, Father Drew. Yes, please, Dr. Melady.
I just wanted to, it reminded me also of the fact that we were in Rome when the Iraq-Kuwait war started. And of course, as it was building up, my husband, was getting the message from the Vatican, that they didn't really approve going to war. And in fact, when the decision was made, he was asked to go to the Holy See and inform them that this was going to start. And he did that. And the message back, from the Pope, and then of course there was a personal letter from President Bush. And but the message back from the Holy Father, and I wanted just to quote it because I remember my husband quoting it: "War is an adventure with no return." And a lot of people were talking about the just war theory then, as they are now. And at the time, the Holy Father said, well, this is not, there are two areas in this just war theory that are not being met in this particular case. And he went into it quite succinctly to explain, that this wasn't meeting proportionality, it wasn't meeting the probability of success, because he was fearing that this would really hinder any other discussions and for peace in the Middle East. So there was just, and I guess, as the Holy Fathers, saw this very clearly, and I think now Francis is bringing this up as well. So we're in an area saying, is war possible anymore? Is it just anymore?
And for those who are joining us virtually, please feel free to submit your questions via Facebook or YouTube, and we will get to your questions at a later point in this program. Now, Archbishop Pierre, I want to quote you because I think this was such a wonderful quote. You made this. You said this at an event at Georgetown. You said, "Often division in the church, sometimes along political lines, occurs because issues are placed against each other rather than within the larger framework of Catholic social doctrine, which necessarily promotes a consistent ethic and culture of life and opposes the throwaway culture lamented by our Holy Father." Especially with what is happening now in the United States, we're in the middle of elections and questions about who is Catholic and who is not. How can we, think about the throwaway culture that the Holy Father laments and recognize what it means to be Catholic in the United States regarding throwaway culture?
First of all, I want to tell you that it is a very good quotation, isn't it? But, it's precisely, I think it's what Mrs. Margaret Melady said about, what happened during the war of Iraq is precisely the method of the church. And the method of the church should be our method, because the church, we are ourselves part of the church. I think one of the danger we have here, and even in this country today, is to put ourselves in front of the church. Even as Catholics, many Catholics today say, well, I don't like the Pope, I don't like the church, but are you not part of the church? So I think the method is precisely that, we are not necessarily in agreement with what happens in the world, especially in these areas of war, this is a good example, but the throwaway cultures, precisely, the difference between rich and poor, the politics which leads to these differences, we are here just to try to resolve the problem. And the contribution of the church is not just the contribution of one party against another. We try to influence the world from our own point of view, but which is not my point of view. It's the result of my encounter with Christ. And what this encounter has changed in my life. And this is why I think the Holy Father at times tells us, we should go in that direction and such directions, not just to confront it because he's the head of a different political party, but he wants to inspire us to change the reality from the point of view of the gospel, from the values of the gospel. And if we have not assimilated ourselves, the gospel, if we have not converted ourselves, if the encounter of Christ has not changed our life, we are still very far away, unable precisely to offer our own contributions. It's interesting to see the wife. We have here the wife of the former ambassador. So the ambassador is supposed to represent, the interests of his country. That's his duty. That's his job. But the ambassador was also a Catholic, and the head of state is supposed to defend the interests of his state. But if he's a Catholic, if he's a Christian, he has to not to combine, but to inspire his own activity from the values of the gospel. And we are so many Catholics. We could change the world, but the method is precisely that, not just to confront with another, one against another, but to, as Father Drew was telling us, disarmament. Disarmament is, we live in the world which is very far from disarmament, by the way. But we have to work for disarmament because our purpose is a fraternal society. Some people say today, well, this is a dream. We are not a fraternal. Yes, we are not a fraternal society. This is precisely the reason why we need, to preach about fraternity. And fraternity is not just with my blood brother or sisters, but fraternity is people with our difference. The Muslim in my society is a brother or a sister, and we have a different colors of skin, but we are brothers and sisters, and we have to work to have this kind of culture of encounter. I remember John Paul II used to speak the culture of love. The different. We have to dream about a different world, and this is the mission of the church.
Thank you. Dr. Melady, as he talks about this culture of encounter, I keep thinking about the Holy Father, the son of Poland, now, the vicar of Christ, going to a small village in Africa and feeling just as much at home there as I'm sure he did in Rome or in Poland. And yet I think some of the struggles we have in the United States is, that we somehow struggle with seeing that there is no border for the gospel. Right? There is no border for Christ's love. How might we look at John Paul II for some inspiration in that way of understanding social friendship and understanding that borders are just physical, but they have no bearing on the gospel?
I think that, again, going back to what I've looked at mostly is, his visits. When he came in any country and any visit, it didn't matter. I mean, obviously he was coming primarily as a pastoral visit to the Catholic community. But in every single case, he met all of the other constituents. He was made sure, that he met with the Muslim leaders, met with the Orthodox communities, met with the Jewish community, for example, was extremely important to him. Remember that he had many Jewish friends, and he really reached out to them very, very, very strongly. And so, and this was, I think, again, a way in which he was saying is that everyone matters. Everyone has dignity. Everyone has that the ability to grow and love back, you know. So, and I think that was also what he did, you know, I think that was mentioned before, that he really was with many of leaders. He influenced a lot of leaders. And how did he do that? Well, he was a very genuine person, listening to them, patient with them. I remember one time, I guess my husband had to go and try to get some answer out of the Holy See, and I think the answer was patience, perseverance, and patience. So, so I think that he did that. I mean, he was able to strike up this friendship with Gorbachev over so many years, and how this was an extremely important to him, and yet knowing that, you know, he was a man who didn't, well, he may have had faith. We don't know that. You know, it could have been. But he was heading a country and a system that was really saying that any religious faith was not, certainly not important to their society. And so he reached out to people who were totally had either no faith or different faith, but it didn't matter. He knew that each person was worth his conversation and his listening. And I'll tell you one other thing about the Pope that I learned. Once in a while we would have visitors. Not once in a while. We always had visitors to Rome. And they would stay with us at our residence, and some of them were scholars that came, and was fascinating to hear all of their points of view. But I remember some of them, of course, had approached saying they would like an audience with the Holy Father. And I remember getting a phone call one day saying, "We're looking for your house guest." This is from the papal office. Okay. Yes, the Pope wants to have lunch with this person, so please get a hold of him. And so I said, okay. And so we sent out the word, and my husband sent the car out to get him and take him over to the Vatican to have lunch. And of course, we peppered him afterwards. You know, what did the Pope say? What did the Pope say? Well, the Pope didn't say very much. The Pope asked lots of questions. And he sat there and listened to me, you know, little old me. And that's exactly what he did. You know, he was a person who was very curious and wanted to learn from the other person. And isn't that something that we should be looking at now? Respecting others, understanding their point of view, listening to them, so that at least we understand each other.
That reminds me of when our Holy Father, Pope Francis, was telling the shepherds that they need to smell like the sheep. And we need to go out and have an encounter, right, to the margins. And we see that Pope John Paul II did that not just in his international visits, but it seems also when he would host people for lunch. He was very interested in them as a person. That's interesting. Father Drew, I'm wondering if, since you helped with the Synod for America, and interestingly enough, that we were to see ourselves as one America, you know, the continent, and not these separate Americas, and having the bishops, I guess, develop how working together. What do you think we can take from that synod that would be important for us to consider today?
Well, I think one of the things we can take is the need to really relate to the local peoples in the Americas in their situations. not to just think it's the governments, but the Holy Father, Pope Francis, has done a lot to encourage popular movements, so which he means groups like labor movements and farm worker movements and so on and so forth. And I think the efforts of the Church on behalf of those people through our various agencies and by the parish to parish work and so on can really be a way of building up that relationship. I think the most obvious thing is immigration, where the bishops of Mexico and the U.S. have worked and collaborated together to try to resist the deportation of people and the exclusion of people from the United States, and the need to be accountable to the problems of the region that are our neighbors, and really respond to them as neighbors and not just as an inconvenient problem.
Respond to them as neighbors. Of course, I'm thinking of the gospel, thinking of love your neighbor. What does that look like? And I would think in particular for us now, the entire world being affected by the pandemic and to me, revealing so our frailty as humans, but at the same time, the Holy Father is telling us that we still need to have social friendship. We need to reach out not in a spirit of fear, but in a spirit of love to our neighbors. And I'm wondering what that looks like now, considering the kind of limitations that we have now. And also I'm thinking of the Holy Father, Pope John Paul II, talking about the new evangelization and using all means, including technology, to spread the gospel. And to me, it seems like that has been another way for us to be able to develop social friendship, is using this new media. How has that played out for you, Your Excellency, in being the papal nuncio and being able to use technology and things like that now, given the pandemic?
Well, we know that technology is an instrument, isn't it? It is used for the good and the bad. And we have the duty. Our calling is to evangelize and to announce the social friendship, but the friendship in the name of God, because it's not just a kind of new way of seeing the relationship with human people, it's rediscovering that we are all brothers and sisters because we have one Father. And this fraternity has a root in God, and this is good news. This is what we are supposed to announce. This is our motivation. So we cannot escape from this motivation. So we have to use all the means of today. And we have to transform, that's our calling also, to transform the instruments of today so that they may be used for the good purpose. Because, social medias are used at times against social friendship, So, and it's exactly the same that the use of politics, the use of, even patriotism, the nations, all the concepts which are part of our life can be diverted for or against the good, the common good, And the common good is always the fraternity. This is why I think Pope Francis he's insisted so much about human fraternity. Not just that he's reducing the values of the gospel to human fraternity, but this is the end results of what we believe in, So we cannot escape from that. And we have the power of the gospel to do so. But we have also to use, the social media, especially today, in this, as you say, in these times of pandemic. At times, even ourselves in the churches, we can reach the people only through internet or through, this is what we are actually doing today, in this room there is nobody. Yeah. But I know that so many people are listening to us. So we can use it for the good. I think it's so important.
You talked about the Holy Father growing up in a country where he was not able to do the things in terms of the faith that many of us could do in the United States. And it seems like also in this pandemic, people have a fear that we won't be able to continue to live our faith in the way that we like. What lessons do you think we should take from Pope John Paul II's life and applying it here now and living under this pandemic and trying to live our faith?
Yeah. Well, he certainly knew how to adapt to it. That's for sure. I mean, I've read stories about how he would devise different pilgrimages with young people and with other people in his parish to go out into the country together, and he would even one time he really got interested in music, and he had these song fests, and he encouraged the young people to join this song fest, and they had winners and all sorts of things like that. So people were interested. Oh yeah, I might win, get first place. So, but they were all religious themes. And the Soviets, they didn't know what was going on, and they were really concerned about this, and yet. We're just having a song fest. We're just, doing this, singing out, and all this. So, and that was he devised a way to go around the problems that they were having. And one time, I guess, he went out into a field. He got all of his people. I guess what happened is that he had a decline from the Soviet leadership that he could not build a church. And so he gathered all the people out into a field and had mass out in the field. And he used the communication means of saying, well, we couldn't build a church, so here we are out in the field. So
we are
exactly.
the church, right.
So we're the church, and we went out in the field. So I think he devised many of those things. And of course, going back to looking at his own papacy, going out on these international visits were a way in which he used communicative means. He was very aware of the media and the media coverage of his international visits. And he used those technologies at the time to really spread the message of the church. And I think, and if you look back in those times, Time magazine was a big thing then, and Time magazine put him on the cover, I don't know how many times, but 3 or 4 times, I think, as Man of the Year. So that was a way in which he and was leading the church, encouraged the church to use technology and of the times to communicate with people and evangelize people. So and now we're seeing we have other means now, and so many churches now are using technology for people who can't get out to church. And here today, as is said, we are using those same means to reach people about Pope John Paul II and Pope Francis.
It's no secret the Holy Father's love of the Blessed Virgin Mary. And in fact, in Ecclesia in America, he references Our Lady of Guadalupe. She's a patroness of the Americas, and how she plays a role in helping us to evangelize. And so I'm just going to have an open question to all of the panel, especially in light of Ecclesia in America, where the Holy Father wanted us to see ourselves as one continent. How might Our Lady help us in that cohesiveness, as seeing ourselves as one continent, and that the work of the evangelization is borderless?
Well, I had the privilege to be the Nuncio in Mexico for 9 years. So I went so many times, in the sanctuary of Our Lady of Guadalupe. She's called the Imperatrice of America, the Imperatrice of the Americas. Yeah? And I remember I had also the privilege to organize the last visit of Pope Francis to Mexico. And I remember when Pope Francis said, well, you organize the visit as you like, but there is only one thing I would like you to do. It's to spend the time I like in front of the image of Our Lady of Guadalupe. This was fantastic, you know. And so he arrives, you know, there are so many people, you know, when in Mexico, when the Pope comes, it's thousands and hundreds of thousands of people. It was wonderful, you know. We arrived in the Basilica, and then the Pope went, you know, to the small room just in front of the image. He was touching the image. He sat down and stayed there for half an hour. You know, on that day, the whole country kept silence. You know, it's difficult to ask the Mexican to keep silence for half an hour, isn't it? So we were all there, you know. And he was silent, contemplating Our Lady. And he said after that, you know, I went, you know, to be seen by Our Lady and to see her. And to see the people of Mexico with the eyes of Our Lady, you know. And, you know, this is what has happened for the last 400 years since, you know, the apparition of the image of Guadalupe. You know, it's and may I say, you know, the nation of Mexico has been, you know, united through this image. This is not just an image, through the person of Mary, the mother of Jesus, you know, and Mary had a mission. This is why, you know, the Vatican II councils, you know, in the document, you know, the Constitution Lumen Gentium, you know, speaks about Mary, the image of the Church. You know, Mary has the mission to receive Christ and to give Christ to the world. This is what the Church is supposed to do, you know. And this is, Pope Francis is fully aware of that, and may I say, Pope John Paul, you know. Yes. I have seen, because I also accompanied Pope John Paul, you know, during his visit in Brazil, you know, where he spent 10 days in Brazil. You know, he was living in the Nunciature, but at 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock in the morning, he was in the chapel. And, you know, to see this man praying was quite inspiring. But he had a kind of strong relationship. I don't speak about devotion. I speak a relationship, because prayer is a relationship, you know. It's not just a devotion to an idea. It's a relationship with a person, you know. For him, Our Lady was the way towards you know, Our Lady helps us to discover Christ. This is her mission. This is why she was chosen by God from all eternity to present her the Son of God, and to help us to understand that we have to relate to Him through her, in the same way that we have to relate to Christ through the Church. And if we are not Church, if we are a divided Church, if in the Church we continue to fight against one another because of ideologies, because we think that our ideas are more important than the presence of God in our Church, so we are not helping the people to make a personal encounter with Jesus. And the mission of the Church is not to announce ideas, not even good ideas, by the way, you know. The mission of the Church, we are not to defend only our ideas and make war against one another, what we have tendency to do. You know, what we have to do is to be humble enough to kneel down and to look at Mary, so that she can help us to look at Jesus and to follow Jesus. And Jesus will teach us how to listen to His word and to transform the world. You know, this is the way. And by the way is not ourselves. You know, the gospel, Jesus in the gospel, I am the way. I am the way to the Father. Follow me, please.
You mentioned earlier about the Great Jubilee, and I have to say, my husband and I took a trip to Rome for the Great Jubilee, and what comes to mind, several things come to mind, but at one time when we were in St. Peter's, it seems like it was on the door somewhere, is a carving of the Blessed Mother, and she's tall and big, and then you see a little Pope sort of like coming to her like, "Mommy, help me, love me," but what I think about here is how she is a comforter. She's someone that we can turn to, and I also think about how she has to deal with all of the children of God in our. Well, sometimes we can be a little bit naughty, you know, but that if we could take that image that at least I could think of how we could turn to her in our time of concern. And to me, knowing that the Holy Fathers are reminding us she is our patroness, she's here to help us, she is the mother of Jesus, to me also should give us some direction about what it means to have social friendship.
You know, you spoke about precisely what Father Drew was speaking about, you know, the synod in America.
Yes.
And the intuition of Pope John Paul II to unite the two churches, you know, North and South, and we are it's one continent. And I think it's so important that we are actually experiencing that today because, by the way, the Pope is from South America.
Right, yes.
You know? And so this is also the providence of God, you know. Why has the providence, you know, chosen a Pope from South America, you know? And it should tell us a lot to us in North America, you know, so that he offers us something which is so deep in South America. It's precisely, you know, this relationship with Mary. You know, you have all over the place, you know, I personally worked in 4 countries, and I've all the time, you know, I've seen this personal relationship with Mary, which helps the people to have an encounter with Christ, you know. So I think, you know, if the unity of America, South and North, you know, and I don't speak between ourselves, you know, will certainly come not only through our own efforts, which are important, but also from our contemplation of the unity of God, which Mary offers us.
Father Drew, I know you're still there on the phone, and you were I was not. Well, I want to make sure that if we have questions from the audience, that we could turn to them now. Okay, could you share one of them?
This is from our online audience. This is for Dr. Melady. It seems that John Paul II's travels teach us a lot about the culture of encounter that Pope Francis talks about. Could you maybe share something about how John Paul II's travels teach us about this culture of encounter that Pope Francis calls for, and how could it relate to regular people's lives?
Well, I think several thoughts I have. One, when I think about encounter, I'm thinking about how he encountered people on the way of his travels. And I remember one particular scene I believe it was in Los Angeles. Or was it? Anyway, it was in California. And he was with a young group. I mean, this was, of course, something that he really developed quite systematically, is that he, you know, this ability for him to speak and talk with young people. You know, he had done that in Poland. You know, he was a teacher. He was very much part of this young group that were in theater at the time. And so he was familiar with the mentality of young people. And so every visit that he had, he insisted having a group of young people meet with him. So in this particular meeting, there was a young man who was could not use, he didn't have arms, but he was playing a guitar with his toes. And this was, if you could visualize the scene, the Pope is up on a platform, sitting on a chair, and this young man was quite a distance away from him, playing this guitar, also up on a platform. And after the music was ended, he was so moved. He was moved to tears. He jumped, this was, of course, when he was young, too. He jumped off the platform, and he ran across to this young man, and he reached up and grabbed him and kissed him. And that was, to me, something so spontaneous, that he had this feeling of love for this person who obviously had encountered quite a bit of issues and conflicts and in his life. And here the Pope recognized that, but he had tried to overcome those. And how wonderful it was that this person was obviously was being led by the Holy Spirit, and he wanted to embrace that person as he was. And he did that several other times. I mean, another time in a visit, he encountered, he was with AIDS patients, and he picked up this little boy. And remember, in those years, there was a lot of problems with AIDS in terms of, should I even touch a person who has AIDS? And the Holy Father just took this young baby in his arms and embraced the baby. And again, that was part of his encounter with people. But he did that in many, many other ways, encountering people who were not of his faith, with a love that he brought to every single person. So I think, that's the kind of thing that we have to look at. We have to always remember that each person deserves our love and our appreciation for their dignity.
As you tell that story, I believe that young man's name was Tony Melendez. And he also, when the Holy Father, after he wrote about Encounter, and the bishops had their convocation in Orlando, Tony Melendez was there and shared his ministry with all of us as well. So, just think about how beautiful that is, that the Holy Father's example, where Tony Melendez is now like a beloved son in the church and still ministering.
That's right.
Very, very encouraging. Yeah. And what is our other question?
So the title of this presentation is Strengthening Our Steps for the Journey Towards the Future. A lot of people are afraid of the future because of the current pandemic. So another person asked, this is for all the panelists, besides be not afraid, what message of hope do you think St. John Paul II will give all of us today to handle the struggle of the global pandemic?
Well, I think it's true that John Paul gave us this sentence, do not be afraid. But it was not just words. I think he's also confronted the reality. And I think it is so important. What Mrs. Melady said, about, being a wife of an ambassador, I realized the difficulty it was, but that's life. Pope John Paul II, with his attention to the person, confronted the ideology, and the world. We remember that at that time, the world was actually separated by ideology, and the ideology is capable to separate the people. People could not talk to one another. People were, not just one or two people, but the whole world was separated. I remember I was in Africa at that time, and Africa was divided by ideology. So what Pope John Paul II said, with the whole church, is that the human person is more important than the ideology, and we have to organize the culture of encounter, which precisely is one of the key words and key action of Pope Francis today. The encounter with the person. Now, the danger of the world today is not the same that maybe 30 years ago when we were separated by Marxism and liberalism, whatever, communism. So, but there are new ideologies raising up, and even at times religious ideologies. This is why I think there is a kind of prophetic vision with Pope Francis today to invite us to go further, but of the ideology, not to remain enclosed in ideology, and not to create new ideologies. But, ideologies are reappearing all the time, even, at times inside the church. What is an ideology? Sometimes we transform a good idea in an ideology, and we fight for it, and we isolate ourselves from the other because of this idea. The idea is good, but we should not transform it an instrument of war. And our ideas has to be proposed and not imposed. And at times, even between different religions. This is why I think Pope Francis is insisting about the interreligious dialogue. We have to dialogue with the others, even if dialogue is not easy. But there would no need of dialoguing if it was easy. Yeah.
What is it? One of the things that I think about when you talk about dialogue, and Father Drew also mentioned Pope John Paul II's strength of mind and the discipline of listening. How is it that we can take the strength of mind and the discipline of listening to listen to people that we think not only have an ideology, but the wrong ideology? How do we enter into dialogue with them to bring the gospel? I mean, you've seen the Holy Father speak at many people in many places that, of course, didn't agree with the church. How did he handle that? What could we learn from that?
I guess I go back to his method of questioning. Sometimes when you're with someone, I remember being myself with someone who was going on about the church and how this person left the church, and I simply said, well, I'd like to welcome you back. Have you ever thought about coming back? Sometimes, it's just one little, I'm sure that's a good idea, and, but maybe you ought to listen to something else, So, but try to really, I suppose what I always had to do in my profession as well was to try to put myself in another person's shoes and try to see, what they're seeing. And sometimes their thoughts are affected by what they've experienced. And I think Pope John Paul II knew that, and I think Francis knows that very well, that people are affected by how others have treated them, for example, or certain circumstances in their lives. And I think that's the kind of thing that we have to understand and be cognizant about, because we can understand that person better, even though you may not agree with that person, but you can understand where they're coming from.
Your Excellency, in light of trying to understand the other person and this universal fraternity that the Holy Father has asked us to, reminded us we have this. This universal fraternity exists, but sometimes we have a difficulty recognizing it or putting it into practice. How much of the Holy Father John Paul II's deep prayer life do you think also enabled him to be able to go out and spread the message in places that were not welcoming, and also not to have a grudge, really? He didn't have a grudge against the Russian government. It didn't come across in that way, and still being able to dialogue with them and influence them for the good. What might we take from that as Americans?
Well, the encounter.
Okay.
I think it's, Mrs. Melady said it, in spite of the difficulties, he met the people. And, remember, the son-of-law of Gorbachev, what time, maybe you remember that story. But, that was, actually, that was not John Paul II, that was already John the 23rd, he had met, because he was also a man, we should not forget, John the 23rd. They are all in the same line. That's interesting, people of dialoguing the person. I would say, this is the philosophy this is why in my introductions I insisted upon that. I think John Paul II was really prepared, even intellectually and spiritually. And you said about prayer life, I think it's to this culture of encounter. You cannot really encounter the other if you feel that you are superior to the other one. And the real humility it is not just a human virtue. It's a gift from God, because, naturally I am proud. Naturally, I think I am better than the others. But, I have to discover. And I think this is a work of prayer. This is a work of, contemplation. I have to discover that, the other has also been created by God. The other is also a son and a daughter of God. So in prayer, I am invited to pay attention to the other. My natural instinct is not to pay attention to the other and to pay attention to me, because I think my ideas are better than the others, So this is the conversion we have to do. And I don't, my experience is that it's difficult to make a real conversion if it is not inspired by God himself.
I was wondering if you had any other little stories you wanted to share about the Holy Father.
Well, that we were talking about, you had brought this up about, you had brought this up that that the Holy Father was able to deal with Gorbachev, and even though, obviously there were big, large differences between them in terms of ideology. But interestingly enough, it was in December of 89, I believe, when Gorbachev made his first trip to Rome. And he brought with him the icons of Russia. Unbelievably beautiful icons that had never been seen before. And they were exhibited in the Vatican. And the Pope and Gorbachev opened this beautiful exhibit. And here they were, standing together, exhibiting these wonderful icons, which pictured, obviously, our Lord and Our Lady. And it was just an absolutely incredible moment. Later on, and of course, during that meeting, during that visit, Gorbachev met personally with the Holy Father. And it just so happened that President Bush, this is H.W. Bush, was about to go and meet Gorbachev off of the island of Malta. And he phoned my husband and said, please ask the Holy Father if I can trust Gorbachev.
Wow.
And of course, my husband made an appointment to see people in the Vatican, to see the Holy Father. And then he wrote his report back to President Bush, and he said, he didn't say, of course, the Holy Father would not say exactly that, but the way he spoke, I am communicating to you that, yes, you can work with Gorbachev. So much later, after President Bush left office, he said to my husband, that message from the Holy Father really helped me to prepare for that meeting, and that's why we were successful in coming together on several agreements. So the influence that the Holy Father had in this encounter with someone who obviously were worlds apart in ideology, but they respected each other. And the Holy Father respected and was able to sit and understand the person in ways that helped the whole world.
Thank you. And as we bring to close our conversation, our memory and identity conversation series today, I want to thank everyone who logged in and joined us virtually. And we hope that these words from our panelists will help you think about what our Holy Fathers have been telling us, that we need to prepare for encounter the person of Jesus in each person, and how important prayer life is, going to the margins and understanding that the gospel unites us regardless of boundaries. Again, thank you so much for tuning in to our Memory and Identity Conversation series here at the St. John Paul II National Shrine. Have a good day.